Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where we will be revealing the new COR Auditing Tool. I'm Amanda Siliker, the Communications and Engagement Manager at Construction Safety Nova Scotia, and today's webinar will be outlining the scoring methodology, sources of evidence, and question guidelines for the new Certificate of Recognition COR Auditing Tool. I have just a few housekeeping slides here before I hand it over to our Manager of Safety Services, Ryan Quinn. So first of all, in case you don't know about us, Construction Safety Nova Scotia is an industry-funded, not-for-profit association focused on improving occupational health and safety in the construction sector. And all companies in the province with a current WCB account under the construction industry classification codes that you see there on your screen are automatically members of our association due to the levies that you pay to the WCB. So there's lots of benefits to being a member. Some of them are here on your screen. There's discounted training. We have classroom training, virtual instructor-led training, online, and also on demand. So we can send one of our instructors to your site. The first year of COR Audit Tool or audit evaluation and training is free for members. There's also free consulting services from our highly skilled OHS advisors. And we have downloadable and customizable templates on our website, constructionsafetyns.ca. There's many different ways to reach out to us. That's one point we always want to make, is that we are here to help you. So you can call us, you can email us, you can see us there on all the different social channels that we're on. You can also pop in to one of our offices. Our main office is here in Burnside, 35 McDonald Avenue. And we've also recently just opened a new office in Cape Breton at the Grand Lake Fire Hall in Sydney. So we have a new dedicated OHS advisor, Warren McKinnon, who handles our Cape Breton region. So feel free to, hang out with us for a little bit, chat about safety. We're here to help you in any way that we can. So now I would like to introduce Ryan Quinn, the Manager of Safety Services at Construction Safety Nova Scotia. He holds his Canadian Registered Safety Professional designation, National Construction Safety Officer designation, and is an ISO 9001 Quality Management Systems Lead Auditor. He worked in the construction industry since 16 years of age as a laborer, helper, flooring installer, and painter, and he's been with CS&S for 10 years. Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Amanda. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll just start off with a little reminder. This has been mentioned a few times, but it's the transition to the new audit tool and the new standard. So as of September 1st, 2023, members will have an option of a one-time choice of using the old instrument or the new instrument when they're conducting their internal audits. Our OHS advisors conducting those external audits will be using the new COR standard, those starting September 1st. And January 1st, 2024, all companies will be using the new COR audit instrument. So for your internals that you conduct yourself and the externals as well, conducted by CS&S OHS advisors. Next slide, please. So today we're going to cover a few topics briefly, just to give you the basic information to help you complete your internal audit. So an overview of some required information that you need to provide when you're completing the audit instrument, guidelines for the questions, the scoring table, observations table, your interview table. We'll look at the summary score table, and we'll wrap up by answering any questions you may have. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the basic information here. As always, we're looking for that company information and making sure it's complete and accurate. So you'll just see there your company name, address, key contact for dealing with the COR audit. Your type of audits there, internals, which you'd be completing yourself, number of current employees, your maximum number of employees, which is important. So we know which classification you fall into. So small business, 2 to 4 employees, intermediate, 5 to 19, and standard size classification there is 20 or more employees. You'll have your WCB business number and your SIC code or codes, brief description of your company, also noting whether you hire subcontractors or not, as that can affect your size classification, and the company auditor information, so the person on staff that is trained to conduct your core audits, or if you use a consultant, they can have their information in there, their name and their company name as well. You'll also see any job sites that are in Nova Scotia at the time of the audit and that may have been visited during the audit. So again, just important to make sure that all that information is there so that the audit can be processed in a timely manner and not negatively affect any of your operations. Next slide, please. So before we dive into the scoring methodology itself, we're just a brief overview of the instrument. So you'll see for every section, you'll have these guidelines here. So we've selected section 2, your hazard assessment analysis and control, to look at here. So you'd see question 2.1. It's going to further elaborate on what the question asks so that it's more clear what you're looking at for evidence, what would satisfy this requirement, and also how you would score that question. And that list goes on from 2.1 all the way to 2.11 on the next slide. There, so every single question in that audit instrument has a guideline to help you there. So we're not leaving things up to interpretation. It's very clear what you're looking at. So hopefully that makes your job as the internal auditor easier, and as well makes our jobs as the external auditor more clear. We should have more consistency in the results from one auditor to another with these great guidelines here. Next slide, please. So here you'll see the main scoring table for a section. Again, sticking with section 2. Here, so hazard assessment analysis and control. In the gray bit at the top, you'll see some text there. The organization shall establish, implement, monitor, and maintain a documented policy statement, procedures, and or guidelines for assessing, analyzing, controlling hazards that is appropriate to the nature of the hazards and the level of risk that your company faces. You'll see the score weighting column there, the technique employed, so that's the source of evidence. The D is your documentation, O is the observations of the workplaces, and I is for your interviews. And the last column over are the points awarded. Anytime you see a column blanked out, so in this case with blue, that source of evidence is not applicable to that question. So you're only looking at the white fields there. So question 2.1, documentation, observations, interviews are all applicable to that question, all have to be looked at. 2.2, documentation and interview only. And then 2.3, you're looking at a single source there of just documentation. Next slide, please. And you'll see at the bottom of the table there, the total points possible from there, which is 45. And in the far column on the right-hand side is where you put the actual points that you've scored yourself in that section. There's a space for any comments there. The more comments, the better. It helps our administrative team understand the scoring and why things were scored a certain way. And it just helps yourself when you're conducting that audit to be able to refer back to any of your notes. Next section, or next slide, please. In the audit instrument, you'll also find a observations table towards the back. You can use that to help throughout the process again, and it will just have simple questions there. Is this safety and health policy posted? Are site-specific hazard assessments conducted? So if you're checking off a yes there, that goes back to that main scoring table we just looked at, and in the observations column, you'd put a check. If you had a yes here, you'd put an X if you had a no in this column. So a little bit of transposing your score from one to the other. Next slide, please. And your interview table, and similar to the audit instrument that we've been using for about the past decade here, you'll see there are questions for employees, questions for management. Sometimes the questions are asked to both groups, sometimes just one or the other group. So 2.1 is asked to employees and management, whereas 2.2 is asked only to employees. Then you'll have your positive and negative answers and your overall result there. So can that employee answer that question to your satisfaction? If so, a check in the positive box. If they can't provide a satisfactory answer, a check in the negative box there. And at a minimum, we're trying to have 10% of the workforce interviewed. If less than 30 people at the company, try to aim for a minimum of 3. But again, the more people interviewed, the more data you have, the better insights you'll have to how your health and safety program is performing. Next slide, please. And at the end of the instrument, you'll have your scoring summary. That is where you're going to tally up your scores from each section, sections 1 through 15 there, and make sure you include all the required information: company name, locations, the auditor name, and the date. You'll see the standard here is 80% overall and 50% in each section. So looking at section 1, safety and health policy, 18 possible points. To hit that 50%, you need to achieve at least 9 points. If you do 9 points or more, minimum standard achieve, yes, and add any comments there. You'll tally those individual section scores all up with the possible score of 390. And to achieve that 80%, you'll have to have at least 312 points there. So 50% per section, 80% overall. Next slide, please. So we'll delve into the actual scoring now. It is slightly different than the previous instrument. So we'll go over the types of questions here, but as we saw in the guidelines, it's going to tell you the source of evidence to look for. So it's going to say look for inspection reports, look for meeting minutes, whatever it may be. It'll outline some examples there to help you narrow your search. And the weighting of the evidence is also found in the guidelines. So it may say award 3 points for documentation confirming that question, award 3 points for interviews if they confirm that question. And we'll see that in a moment here. So types of questions. 5 main types. So it can be a little tricky when you're first getting used to it, but once you run through the instrument once or twice and read all the guidelines, it becomes pretty clear. And again, those guidelines are going to tell you exactly what you need to do. So we have a question type, all sources of evidence. So you'd have documentation, observations, and interviews. There's one question like that only, and there's partial point scoring there. So with partial points, it can be, like I said, award 3 points for documentation, 3 points for interviews, 3 points for observation, whenever it may be, but it outlines that. So you don't have to have every source of evidence confirming, the question, just certain ones to receive some points. Then we have and questions, which we have two types of. We have an and question that's all or nothing scoring. So both sources of evidence need to confirm the evidence. So both positive in the documentation and the interview. If one or the other is not confirming the question, or you score that an X, it's going to be a 0. We have and questions that are partial points. So it's, again, 3 points for documentation, 3 points possible for interviews. If interviews are negative, but the documentation confirms the question, again, you can award those 3 points. We have your or questions, one source of evidence required to be confirmed out of the 2, and single source of evidence questions, where it's just looking at documentation, observations, or interviews. And those will be all or nothing questions. So let's take a deeper look now on the next slide. So here we go for the partial point question with all sources of evidence. You'll see the guideline there is noting award 2 points based on documentation of completed formal hazard assessments as per company policy directive. Award 3 points based on observations that formal hazard assessments accurately reflect activities on site and are made readily available. And award 2 points based on the majority of positive interview responses. So just for an example there, up in the first row, you'll see a check, and an X. Looking back at your guidelines, we'll see 2 points, 3 points, and we didn't get the additional 2 points, so we have a score of 5. And a little tip to help you out, whenever you see the range 0 to 7, 0 to 6, whenever it may be, those are partial point questions. When you just see a single digit there, single number, that's going to be an all or nothing question. It's either the 3 points or a 0, 4 points or a 0. Next slide, please. So for this question here, we have the and question, and it's an all or nothing scoring. So looking at the guidelines here, that says both documentation and interviews must be confirmed to award points. In this example, documentation could not confirm that completed hazard assessments describe existing and potential hazards. But the interviews are positive there, so a check for the interviews, but again, it's an all or nothing question, so the score will be 0. Next slide, please. And question 2.3 is that single source of evidence all or nothing question there. So it's either a check, it confirmed it, an X is a negative result. We couldn't confirm that this is being done here. So with the check, we award the 3 points. If that would have been an X, it would have been a 0 points awarded. So that's a pretty simple one there. Check, points, X, no points, you're 0. Next slide, please. Now we have the other type of and question, and this is the and with partial points possible. So you'll see the range there, 0 to 6. Refer back to your guidelines. It's going to help you and say what we're looking for. So documentation must show that risks on hazard assessments are reassessed, reevaluated when there's changes to the people, equipment, material, environment, or processes. And then goes on to discuss the frequency of this type of assessment, so on. All things that you're going to be evaluating when you're looking at that documentation and when you're asking those interview questions. So for the scoring guidelines here, award 3 points based on documentation and award 3 points based on the majority of positive interview responses. And for the example, Documentation confirmed the question, but interviews were negative. So we have the 3 points. Next slide, please. And finally, an interesting type of question, an or question. So with an or question, you don't have to have both sources of evidence to confirm it. It can be one or the other. And this is to allow some flexibility there with some of those questions. So it could be a question about posting requirements. Well, if you're solely working from a pickup truck, it's pretty hard to have a big safety board and post everything. But do you have that information readily available? And can staff positively answer that interview question of where they can find that information? So that could be an example there. In this case, we're looking at our controls developed for identified hazards using the hierarchy of controls. So we may be able to see that through the hazard assessment process or the completed hazard assessment form, or we can look at the observations and see that there's actual physical controls in place, there's safe work practices available and being followed. So you can have one or the other, you can have both, which is even better. So in this case, observations confirmed it, so full points. If it would have been an X in documentation and an X in observations, again, that would be a 0 there. So it's that all or nothing when it comes to that 4 points. But where you confirm that question from depends on the realities of the work you do. And just make sure to take good notes so that our administrators can see why you scored that way. Next slide, please. So again, just back to that observations table there, you'll see, the check is the positive. We confirm that in our observations. The X is the negative, and then you just transfer those scores back over to that main scoring table that we were just looking at. And the next slide. So the interview table here. This has been tricky for some folks in the past, but it's the same scoring methodology as we've always used in our instrument. So you have positive, negative, and then the overall result. 50% positive or 50% in the positive column is going to equal 50% positive overall. Where you need to be careful is looking at some of these questions being asked to both employees and management. So you need to take that tally of both the checks and X's from the employee and the management group here. So if we look at 2.1, you will see a positive for the employee, a positive from the management, and then 3 negatives and 1 from employees and 1 negative from management. So it equals a negative overall result. More negatives than positives. 2.2, we'll see 3 positives for employees. There, 1 negative. Look down at management. We didn't ask that question to management. Perfect. More checks in the positive column equals that overall positive there. And 2.4, we'll see that is applicable to both employees and management. We'll see 1 positive for employees, 2 positives for management, so that's 3, and 3 negative for the employees, so that's that 50-50 split. When it's 50% positive, the overall score is positive there. So again, always remember to look at both employees and management and tally up the total there when that question is asked to both groups. If it's asked to only management or only employees, you just need to concern yourself with the positive and negative for that group. And again, these scores will be transferred back to the main scoring table there with an N equaling an X on that table, a P equaling a check mark, confirming that question. Next slide, please. And then just back to that scoring summary sheet there where you bring it all together. So we already touched on that earlier there, but the main thing to remember, 80% overall and 50% in each section. So this is a change to the percentages required based compared to the previous audit instrument. And the next slide. So that's the gist of it. Pretty straightforward with the guidelines. The guidelines definitely help with the scoring itself. In the future, with the potential for electronic options, the math will be done for you. But when you're still using a paper copy, doing things like that, you'll have to do the math yourself. But it's just good to know how everything's calculated.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ryan. That was a great overview. If anyone has any questions for Ryan, you can just type it in the comments on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever you're watching this. And then we will get a pop-up here and Ryan will answer that question for you. So we can just maybe wait a couple of seconds here to see if any questions pop in. It's a good opportunity to remind you to visit our website, constructionsafetyns.ca. Lots of great resources there for you. Everything from COR to return to work to mental health. Really, Construction Safety Nova Scotia has been putting a lot of effort into the mental health section. So a ton of great resources there. There's sample toolbox talks, there's videos, there's a lot of great stuff there. And as well as an entire sample safety toolkit. So everything that you need for your COR journey is all on our website with lots of great templates that you can customize for your own organization. Okay, we do have one question that popped in here. It says, thank you, Ryan, for this. On the OR element items, can we expect the external auditor to score from the other scoring option?
So when the external auditor is going to look at that, we'll take into account the realities of how that your business is operating. If we can confirm both sources of evidence, we will, but we'll apply a lot of flexibility in using those questions there. So I'm not 100% clear on the other scoring option, but we will treat it the same way the internal auditors will. So again, we won't expect to have check marks in both. It can be one or the other, and that's how our auditors will treat that.
Excellent. And then we do have another question here wondering if it's possible to see a copy of the audit instrument.
Great question, and it is, and it's hosted for download on our website, constructionsafetynovascotia.ca. There's a drop-down menu for COR, and in the bottom of that drop-down menu, I believe it will say New COR. Go on there, and towards the bottom of the page, I think, Amanda, is...
Yep, just keep scrolling.
Just keep scrolling, and you'll find it, and you can download that there and familiarize yourself with that instrument.
Yeah, that's a great point too. There's also a lot of other information and resources on that page. Ryan did a previous webinar as well, and in case you guys missed it, it's the video for that webinar is on that page, so you can learn just about the COR changes in general, which is very helpful if you haven't checked that out yet. There's also a FAQ section, which many folks have been finding helpful during this process. And just a whole bunch of different info there to help you through this. And we definitely want to make the point that we are here to help you through this change. If you have any questions at all about the new COR, the process, if you're confused in any way, please do reach out. Ryan and his team of advisors and our wonderful team of administrators are available to help you as well. So it's looking like there's no more questions here for now. So I think we'll wrap this one up. Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.